thanks so much for everyone who's here with us. I'm here with three experts who will be joining on this panel on open innovation called COVID and Beyond. And this is basically to talk a little bit about the moment in time that we're in, especially because the pandemic has brought us into this space where people have come online more and more, and there's been a surge in collaboration. So we want to discuss a little bit about the implications of this and the pitfalls as well that open innovation can bring, and of course to know a little bit about the work that our experts have been doing in this past year. So if you may, I'd like for you three to introduce yourselves, give you 30 seconds to introduce your work, and then we can get started with some questions so that you can delve into the interesting work that you do. So I'd like to begin with Tarek Lubani, please.
Hi there, my name is Tarek Lubani. I'm an emergency physician who works in Canada, in a city called London in Canada, and also in the Gaza Strip. So my main task and my main sort of thing that I'm working on here is really trying to create equal access to medical devices through using tools like open source and open access.
Thanks so much. Shah, please.
Hey everyone, I'm happy to be here. My name is Shah Selby. I am a conservation technologist, which means that I try and develop and adapt technologies to be used out for kind of environmental sort of applications. So I work 100% open source, everything that we do. I'm also a National Geographic explorer. So I founded an organization called Conservify. It's a nonprofit open source technology development lab that's focused exclusively on wildlife conservation, ecology, environmental protection, how we can create the tools that allow us to actually understand the changes that are happening to this planet and kind of protect the species that need the most protection. And then recently started another nonprofit that's called FieldKit. You can go to fieldkit.org to kind of learn more about that. And the focus behind that was I kept on seeing that there was a lot of tools that were used in the environmental space that were they're proprietary, they're unnecessarily expensive. And so we're focused on creating low cost, open source, but still scientifically relevant environmental monitoring sensor systems. So this is kind of the project that I'm going to be mostly talking about today, because it's been a bit of a roller coaster over the last year and a half, trying to build a hardware, software, app product that requires people to go out into the field when nobody's going anywhere. So, and the chaos that you see behind me is because I'm actually leaving on our first FieldKit expedition since the start of COVID to the Jaw Reserve in Cameroon in a couple hours. So it's a little hectic over here. So thanks.
And please, Nicolas.
Wow. Hey, hello, everyone. My name is Nicolas Schifano. I work at Microsoft in a team called Open Innovation. It's part of legal. And our goal really is to help Microsoft, our customers, partners, and the communities at large to innovate in the open and share this innovation as much as possible. We've been behind various programs, open innovation programs at Microsoft, such as the Open COVID Pledge, which is a patent pledge, or the Low Carbon Patent Pledge. We've been also leading certain pledges for open source, either in terms of patents or copyrights. More recently, our focus has been around data innovation, and we launched last year an open data campaign for Microsoft, really with the goal of advocating, among other things, for more data collaboration, more open data sharing by corporate entities.
Thanks so much. So this question is just to open up for you to talk a little bit about the work that all of you are doing. And it's about the collaboration that's happening since the beginning of the pandemic. I think that we've come to a point in time where the moment arrived where open innovation was needed, collaboration, the use of open licensing for sharing designs across the web, for building, etc. How has collaboration been useful for you, and how prepared do you think we have been at this point in time? So for whoever wants to start.
I'm happy to get things started off. Really, the way that I sort of looked at it is that before the pandemic hit, we had all of these seeds that existed out in the community. And so there were lots of people out there who were advocating open access. There were lots of people who were working on supply chains and other aspects. So I come from the medical world, so I'll focus a little bit on the health sector. Overnight, basically, our supply chain collapsed in the health sector in Canada. And we depended on our friends and colleagues in the Gaza Strip, where GLIA had been running projects that didn't depend on an external supply chain, essentially manufacturing their own equipment. And we were able to sort of ask them, well, how do we very quickly scale up manufacture of, for example, PPE? And they were able to help us do it. These projects were then kind of fed by lots of the governments that recognized what many people had been telling them for quite a while, which is redundancy is not bad, and you really do want to keep some independence about the manufacturing sector. So the way that I sort of look at it is that it was very much a wake-up call, and we did really move forward tremendously in terms of our ability to create things out in the open, our ability to collaborate, and our ability to manufacture domestically. Now, where I think the problem lays is that everybody's keen to go back. And that's where I think we have to be very anxious and careful to burn the bridges that we crossed, because almost all of them, there were some bad ones, of course, but almost all of them are positive developments. It is a positive development that every company has had their feet held to the fire as to why it is that their access isn't open. It is positive development that medical journals were forced to release all of their science. And if we go back to what it was like before, then we have seen the promised land, as it were, of open access and open source. And despite that, we would have been beaten back.
Yeah, I can add to that, but I think that's fantastic. I mean, the medical industry has been, I hope, forever changed through this to react. For us, as I mentioned earlier, it really changed a lot of the way that people do conservation and ecology, because field programs were basically done. Now, we saw some positive impacts because no one could travel, so the human impacts on some of these places momentarily got better. Unfortunately, I worry that as soon as everything's opened up again, it's just people have cabin fever and they're just gonna go wild. But it's caused a lot of the folks in the field that I work within to really think about, how do we make better tools that can kind of monitor the health and the status of these areas when we don't really require a lot of people to go out there. One really great thing that I've seen, it's been happening in previous years, but COVID really pushed it, was the fact that traditionally ecologists worked in a manner that is kind of a lot of times called parachute science, which means, you have these academics from big universities that travel to some high biodiversity areas, like some of the most beautiful and pristine areas in the world. And those end up being in the global south or in the tropics, in places that don't have, Harvards and Yales and all these places that send their scientists into these regions. And COVID's really forced a lot of that traditional model to focus more on capacity building of local scientists. How do we get tools into the hands of the people who live there and have them study their own backyards and work collaboratively in a global way? And, that's kind of the main push behind FieldKit, was how do we create a tool that's accessible to those sorts of populations, and not something that requires big grant budgets to purchase. Our plan originally was to launch FieldKit to the world on the 50th anniversary of Earth Day, and that was in 2020. But in April of 2020, we looked around and we said, okay, maybe it feels a little bit irresponsible to launch a product while everybody is so anxious they can't sleep at night, right? And no one's doing any of that stuff. So we decided instead we're just going to give away a bunch of field kits, and so we gave them away. They went to like 26 different countries in the world to try and help kind of push some of that forward. But I think that my industry as a whole is really trying to think about what does field work look like moving forward. But I think that the comfort that people have around remote work and working with collaborators all over the place, that comfort level is only a net positive when it comes to doing science in a more equitable and global way.
Yeah, and so for our part, I think COVID really created a sense of urgency and towards data sharing and collaboration, or more generally innovation sharing and innovation collaboration, like Tarek was saying. On my side, I'm in legal, so I tend to focus on legal things, and we've seen certainly a renewed interest around data sharing agreements, legal frameworks for data collaboration, really with the aim of making it easier for data providers, for people sharing to reduce risk, and especially from downstream claims, while also bringing more clarity to the legal security about what can be done with the data. We've seen also certainly an increased interest and increased relevance of the need for data collaboration or open innovation collaboration in corporate circles. It will be interesting to see, how much of that will kind of go back to normal, as Shah and Tarek was saying, once the crisis is over, so to speak, and how much of that will, this understanding of for open innovation, how much of that will remain. We've seen also, just as an example on that, for instance, as part of COVID, we had teams at Microsoft engage in many different projects, and one particular area which I think is interesting in the importance of having access to mobility data to model, estimate the transmission in real time of the disease, and so relying on kind of mobile phone data from operators. However, that data is actually highly valuable for those folks and has high commercial value. And so, even during COVID, it was sometimes difficult for researchers to get access to that data. And so I think, post-crisis, we have to think about how do we, what is the revenue consequence? What is the business model for opening up certain data, certain assets, and in a way which is sustainable for their providers? I think this will be really important going forward if we want to keep the momentum behind open innovation.
Emilio, do you mind if I just say a comment sort of in response there?
Please.
Nicolas, I think one of the things that you're working on, which is really interesting, is trying to figure out how the money works. And one of the things that I think I've learned sort of being at the front line is that the money is a mask very often for doing things that aren't actually best for the people around. So for years, I've been now a practicing physician for over a decade. And every year we would have these budget meetings in which they would talk to us about efficiency and redundancy and costs and so on. And my concern is that it became very clear during COVID that the money isn't even close to the leader here in terms of our main considerations. And so I think one of the things that we really have to get right going forward is, I think, a reorganization of our priorities, where we're not so driven, and I understand that this may be a complete societal shift, but not so driven by how it is that we can derive the profits. That may be that the governments have to intervene. That may be that we as people have to intervene. But if at the end of this, we end up in my hospital in our budget next year talking about how we have to reduce our inefficiencies again, then I guarantee you it won't be long before we're back in the same kinds of problems that we're in now.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, across the industry, you have certain entities. I mean, it can't be, I think we have to be like, to start at one place and kind of increase from there. We can't change the system as a whole in one go. So for instance, certain corporate entities realize the importance of, sharing data, contributing to on important issues. And just to take another example, rather than COVID, just even the sustainability crisis that we see. And so for instance, Microsoft has been sharing for many years now, corporate indicators of industrial activity in terms of water consumption, waste generation, energy consumption, in a way which is very transparent, it's very open. You can, kind of go online. It's out in the public. What I'm trying to say is that if we want to keep this, to broaden the scope of entities sharing, especially on the corporate side, then there will be friction. Which is, I'm not saying it's a good thing. I think it's just something we have to keep in mind and try to figure out how to address that. Not unlike, the open source movement has done it for software. They have found a model where, it's possible for corporate entities to justify sharing openly technologies with, very few restrictions, and at the same time be able to, articulate a business model around them. These things can, like there will be things which are either or, like a zero-sum game kind of thing, but there will be things where perhaps, by being innovative, we can also create more opportunities to have more sharing and collaboration.
Yeah, picking up where in this. Oh, please.
I was just going to add too. I think the other giant elephant that COVID has shaken loose is what Tariq mentioned earlier, was that supply chains have just been absolutely insane during this time, right? And so like we've seen all these run on parts. As somebody who makes hardware, it's been a very difficult time to try and create something that doesn't constantly have to be redesigned for other things. And we really, our organization tries to be very minimize waste and think a lot about how we build things in a way that they can be, reused or recycled and all this sort of stuff. And it's hard when we've seen the entire global supply chains collapse. That's really impacted a lot of the stuff that we've done. And I hope that moving forward, we think about more resilient and different ways to do that. It's hard when you're talking about chip manufacturers because it costs quite a lot to start one of those operations. But everything else, I think we can be a lot smarter about our supply chains.
Yeah, I agree. And this moves perfectly to a new question, which is that the pandemic has definitely brought together lots of people to innovate from a mindset of scarcity. And scarcity is good when you think of a mindset. This is, the emergency that we're in, but it's not necessarily the desired environment on which people want to innovate. The example of not having the funds to do it, not having the materials, not having specific organizational support, etc. And I think we have become better in general to deal with this. But now that in a way we're coming back to our usual life to some degree, what things can we bring from this experience forward, and what do we need in order to this be sustainable, as you were mentioning? What do you think?
Yeah, perhaps I can go first on this one, and we kind of take turns on who goes first, unless someone has like something they want to say right now. But if not, just on a slightly different angle than the previous question, I think to keep the momentum, in the kind of post-pandemic, I think for instance, again, going back to my topic of interest, which is data. As a society, I don't think we really value data sharing. And scientists, they can't really work if they don't have access to the data. We've seen that the importance of this, for instance, in research papers, where you may have certain breakthroughs which are articulated in the paper, certain results, but without access to the underlying data, how do you reproduce? How do you actually can work with the result as such? Yet from a value perspective, I think as a society, we value more the result, the breakthrough, the shiny headline, rather than the work enabling all this, the sharing that happens, the meticulous collection of data that really is fundamental for all this. There's kind of from that perspective, the risks for sharing are clear. However, the rewards are not necessarily very clear. There is no value associated with sharing yet, I think, as much as it should be, really, to drive this sharing in a way which is sustainable. And just to give another example of things that may be relevant going forward, continuing investing in frameworks that support the sharing, and so make the rewards more quote unquote interesting for data providers, and also the risks lower. Having the right legal frameworks is really important. Having also the right technology. You hear about differentiating differential privacy, to be able to share data in an anonymized way, so that you can't track the data back to data subjects in a way which would be a breach of their privacy. All these things are really important to making sure that we can continue having access to this data, underpinning the relevant research and underpinning the relevant results that are so crucial.
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned this earlier, but I'd really like to see us continue to be comfortable with working with people remotely. We've had really great success with finding fantastic collaborators, or even folks that I brought onto the team that live in places that we wouldn't normally look for those sorts of roles. And so I think open innovation in a world that's very comfortable with remote, after we've all done it for almost 2 years, I think that's a good thing for anyone's project moving forward, and just for the nature of work. The other thing, so I sit on the board of the Open Source Hardware Association, and one of the things that we saw over the COVID time was that a lot of projects focus on documentation and actually get OSHA certified. So I think documentation is a thing, as developers, maybe a lot of us don't really like to do it, but it's an absolutely critical and fundamental part of being open, right? And so I'd like to see that to kind of continue on as we move forward. People work on documentation when they're sitting around waiting for parts and things like that, so that we can make something that is actually truly open and not just open in name.
I really enjoyed the way in which you phrased it, Emilio, talking about the idea of scarcity. I think one of the things that kind of hit me almost as an aha moment was that not that there was suddenly scarcity where there used to be abundance, but rather that we have uncovered the scarcity that always existed, that we had been covering it up. And so this is also a process, and I really enjoy that, we as a panel are talking about not just COVID, but also the looming environmental crisis, which is coming, especially Nicolas's comments. And really, when we sort of look at that, our planet is incredibly scarce, and lots of the things are incredibly scarce. And for the first time, we've been able to see that really clearly. On the flip side, as Nicolas has said kind of a couple of times, there are these things that are really abundant, data being one of them, our abilities being another one, and our ability to collaborate. What I think that we're doing right now is sort of recalibrating, and all of us have recalibrated. Whether we forget about this moment or not in 5 years, we all realize that information and knowledge is abundant, obviously people's opinions too, and that things on our planet are scarce. Now, how we relate those things and how we pull them together is where I think things like Creative Commons come in. I don't consider Creative Commons as just being a license for open access. I consider it as being, I guess, a way of life or an ethos where we look at the things that are being made artificially scarce and we make sure that they become abundant in real life. And we look at the things that are being made artificially abundant and we make sure that we recognize that they're scarce in real life. We take documentation, we take data, we take hardware, we take equipment, and we say to people like, hey, there's no good reason why you can't access this. So let's make it available. Actually, I have, as an example, this stethoscope, which luckily I have with me now that I was thinking about it. This is an example, a stethoscope. This one costs $3 US, $2.83 to make, and it works just as well as a Littman Cardiology 3. Now it's one generation away from the newest, which costs about $300. Like, why does a stethoscope that's 200 years old cost $300? And as you can tell from this is recycled plastic that was made in the Gaza Strip. This is like a duotang cover for old people like me who remember what duotangs are. And then these tubes come from Coca-Cola fountain machines. So it's not about, I think what we're doing here is we're basically breaking artificial things, both in terms of scarcity and abundance.
And I'd like you to talk a little bit about and we do have we're talking about data, about consumption, about medical hardware, but they're all connected to the impact outside of the online. So, hold on, I'm going to show. Yeah, so I'm curious, what do you think is the movement moving forward, especially because we are the ones who are at the forefront of an open innovation, of collaboration? Where are you headed?
Okay, Emilio, we had a really hard time, at least I had a hard time hearing you, so I'm going to say what I think you were saying, which is that you were asking, as people who are on the innovative end of the spectrum, what is it that we want to do next? Is that kind of where you're going? Okay, thank you. Maybe Shaw, did you want to start?
Yeah, so what do we want to end up doing next? Is that the question? Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that within the conservation technology space that I work on, there's been, I think the open innovation sort of projects have been leading the way, fortunately. There's a few of us very vocal folks who focus primarily on open innovation. And I really want to, within that world, I'd really want to push the fact that these projects aren't so centralized in the US and in the EU, and that they are coming out of other places. And so we're really, one major push that we're working on is how do we work to develop communities in other regions that can take the designs that we've created and build them themselves and innovate on themselves and start answering some of these questions in a way that's not so Western world centric. And so, I'm really, really optimistic about the impact that open innovation has on changing that parachute science model that I was talking about before. And I think that my main focus, moving forward is how do we push that needle? As somebody who's a tool maker, the thoughts that you had on scarcity and all that sort of stuff was really, really important. It's something that we see in my industry as well, right? I mean, for a long time, anybody who wanted to study the oceans, there are only, one or two types of systems that they buy to study these things, and they cost tens of thousands of dollars. And that's not for any sort of reason other than the fact that it's just one company that's been building these things, or two companies that's building these things for a really long time. And I think that open innovation really gives us the opportunity to reshape these industries, and if we just lean into it, we can really do a lot of great stuff. The one thing that I really worry about moving forward is, there was a lot of enthusiasm about working remotely and like doing things over Zoom and all this stuff early on. And I think everybody's gotten quite tired of it nowadays. And so how do we take all the good work and the gains that we've had moving forward and keep the momentum in a way that just doesn't involve Zoom fatigue and all this other stuff that we're seeing? And that's a really hard question. I don't know the answer to it, but we try and think a lot about what does an open innovation community look in our space post-COVID. And it's going to look very different than what it looked like before. Hopefully much, much better. So.
Yeah, and perhaps at my level, something I really am interested in kind of the structure of societies and structure of innovation, which leads to certain outcomes. And one of the to kind of continue one of the things that Shah mentioned in the previous question, the importance of, for instance, not only incentives to innovate or incentives to sharing, but also the importance of certain roles to make that happen. Shah, you mentioned the importance of documentation when enabling others. That's really, really important. If you don't have the right documentation, you can't really empower others to continue your work. You are not creating these network effects that are so powerful in an open innovation system. And for instance, in the context of data, which is again one of my interests, one role which is really important is the role of data stewardship. We hear a lot around data scientists, around about the importance of data engineers to work with to enable the work on the technical level in an efficient way. But data stewardship, the more quote unquote business oriented side of the data management. How do we create an environment where we have the same level of recognition for that work than for the other roles? And I think this will be a challenge. For instance, if you take the open source movement, the folks doing documentation, I don't know that they receive the same recognition as the folks doing the software, for instance, writing the source code. So we'll see how it goes, but I think it will really take a joint effort. It will require bring new people who are not necessarily familiar with this space into that space. Kind of create these incentives and the recognition systems for having broader participation.
All right. Well, I guess I'm going to start with a bit of a bold statement, which is that not only is open access and open source winning, it has already won. So we can look at this model right now as something where we have achieved gains that would have really truly been unimaginable even a few years ago. And definitely not picking on you, Nicolas. I mean, I think that the work that you're doing is amazing. However, for those of us who were around in the 90s, who would have imagined that Microsoft would be at the table talking about open source in a serious way? So this is a huge move, and it's not obviously just Microsoft. There is no major corporation that doesn't at some level engage seriously with open source. So we have now really moved the needle in a big way. And that's because really open source is conveniently actually a better development methodology in a lot of ways. But to me, that's not so relevant as the fact that it is actually better in ethical terms too. Now, the problem with having gotten here is that there are some companies who will take the approach of embracing and then doing things with it that are nefarious. This used to be called embrace, extend, extinguish, and there are lots of other terms that lots of companies have used for the same kind of a thing. So it means, just like any sort of win that happens, we have to be on guard to maintain our gains. Okay, so I think that there was a lot of groundwork laid. I think that there was a lot of good work done. And then during COVID, I think that we really made certain things impossible. Like, I don't think Elsevier can go back to its totally closed system. They're a publisher of medical and other academic information. But they're going to try, and they're going to try that by confusing us, using the terms open access for things that aren't, or companies using the term open source for things that aren't, by also just generally like avoiding or defeating us at other levels. So for example, if they can't win in natural economic terms, then they'll introduce artificial legal barriers or artificial stuff like digital locks and things like that. So I'm very optimistic. I think that going forward, we all have a few jobs ahead of us. You know, obviously for me individually, I have to work on medical devices and keep working on that angle. But I also think that all of us have to consider ourselves as being engaged in a kind of cultural change project where we really do have to ensure that the gains that are made aren't lost. Because yes, we've done a lot, but as we've seen in so many other places, it can collapse relatively quickly.
Thank you.
I also want to add a little bit more. One area that I think we need to do a little bit more thinking of in around open innovation is how these projects are supported and kind of maintained over time. What in one of the huge kind of question marks there is how we deal with funding. So I think about this a lot because, you know, the world of ecology is not a moneymaker. Nobody comes into this to retire early, and funding is not quite an easy thing to do. And so we've found that a lot of like the traditional funders of things in this space do value open innovation, which is fantastic. These are the foundations that have been funding a lot of these environmental projects. But you know, I also think we need to figure out a way that open innovation can be funded in other sort of sustainable ways. And you know, that's one thing we think a lot about with FieldKit is how do we build a model that has hardware and is a nonprofit but still can support itself maybe off of revenue, and it doesn't have to be searching for grants all the time to keep these things going. And I think a lot of open projects fall down when it comes to how do you make this you know, work out financially so that you can continue to improve the project and, you know, have developer support and have support of the people who have a lot of questions, and you know, those things require engineers and lots of other folks to keep them moving. And so, you know, the value that funders have for open innovation changes drastically depending on the industries that you're in. And I think that if there's some way we can push that more broadly, it's going to be a net benefit to us all.
Great. Audio breaking right now. Before moving to the Q&A, there's a lot of discussion on open innovation, but in the end, and I see this from the work of the panelists, that a lot of the work has to create some impact offline. And sometimes we can have this vision of online work that makes us not necessarily go or enhance the models. And I panel with people who are working on. So my question is, how do you think we should move forward with all the good things that open innovation pandemic and work together and do not have access or, you know,
I'll read the question because we really couldn't hear you, Emilio. So you said, just in case this breaks up when I add a new question, all of the work of open innovation cannot be innovative work if it doesn't impact the communities it serves. However, the online work can create a gap between us and more marginalized communities. How can we address this? Would one of you guys like to go first, or shall I? Okay, I'll go ahead. This is just about the hardest question. Like literally, this is the question that keeps me up at night. You know, because I have a post at an academic institution, like in what is commonly called the ivory towers, and it's really hard to be able to remain stuck or attached to the people who matter and the end users. I don't really have a great answer for this one. I really don't know how we can ensure that our work is always accessible to marginalized communities. I do know that some of the building blocks include, I guess, from the technical side, always making the work available and with no barriers. And that really is open access and open source. But that's not enough. Like, I know that that's a necessary condition. It's not a sufficient condition. And so I think another part of it really has to be creating the conditions on a humanitarian level for people to be able to access that work. You know, that means things like education and proper funding in these types of communities. People aren't always able to do the work themselves if they're in a marginalized community, but often they are. And so I think enabling them is a real key. But I just want to recognize how difficult I think the question is, and how poor I think my answer to it is.
Yeah, this is, you know, as Dirk said, this is a really difficult problem, and it's something we think about a lot. The community work is so critical when it comes to effective conservation, and this is something that for decades we've been horrible at as people who work in wildlife and ecologies. Is that it's really, if we want places to remain, you know, as pristine as they can, if we want to create situations where animals don't go extinct, we really have to think a lot about the communities that live in these sorts of places. How do we work on capacity building? If we're creating tools for them, how do we make sure that these tools are accessible and available, and that there's the right sort of kind of education around that? It even involves kind of creating these education systems to you know, go along with the stuff that we're bringing in. And you really want to be able to, when you're bringing tools to these communities, you have to make sure that the things that you're bringing in is something that the community actually wants, right? And how do you make sure that there's like a very real ownership over the stuff that you're creating, and that they want to take those tools and answer the questions that they have, and not some arbitrary questions that you come in. So, you know, we have a community manager in FieldKit that thinks about this like all the time, is like, how do we have real, honest interactions with the communities, and how do we structure our nonprofit in a way that we could provide whatever support is needed to build out those ideas and those questions and those programs, and you know, with the end goal of making a world that is better for the communities that live within those places, but also, you know, the plants and animals and ecosystems that surround them. This is a really, really important thing to do, and I think at least within the industry that I work in, there's a huge push right now about how do we end parachute science? How do we work with indigenous communities? How do we, you know, rethink the way that we're doing science in the field so that's not structured in this very Western mindset? And then, you know, what do we create? What are these tools that we're creating in this open innovation that will help to support that stuff, and maybe pull together scientific knowledge and traditional knowledge, or all these sorts of different things? And it's a huge amount of work, but fortunately I found that there's a lot of people who are really excited about pushing that sort of thing forward. And when we first built FieldKit to focus very much on kind of environmental monitoring and scientists, and then ended up finding out that like the most passionate questions that we are getting were for people who are dealing with environmental justice issues, you know? So, you know, we have this power plant in my backyard that's spewing out all this stuff. How do I document that? How do I tell my story and change the way those things are happening? It's really like, you know, stop these sorts of industrial things and happening in communities where a lot of times they didn't have that voice. And so we've been focused a lot over the last couple years on how to create better tools to help exactly those sorts of things. And so I would say nowadays, you know, instead of being 100% science, we're, you know, split between science, environmental justice, and just broad education. And I think that's kind of how we have to think about these things moving forward.
Yeah, so just on top of that, perhaps from a corporate perspective, so I won't pretend I have a good answer to that, but just a couple of thoughts. I think when you focus at one particular piece of open innovation, making sure that it's accessible to everyone, that you don't have terms, or it's not shared in a way which is just difficult to access, or it has friction. I think it's also important to realize that there are other elements that kind of combine with each other, like around sustainability or others or digital literacy. You can't, for every project, you can't solve every issue. So you just have to think more broadly with different programs on how to leverage each of those, and at the end they kind of combine together. One thing I would say from a corporate perspective, it's very tempting to kind of develop something internally and kind of throw it over the wall under an open license and call it open. You still retain control, you retain control in terms of what you share, you retain control in terms of the roadmap, from a technical perspective, industrial perspective, you want to build engagement this way. But I think if we are talking about like maturity levels of open, I don't think that this is, I think it can work really well for certain scenarios, but perhaps what along the lines of what, Shah said, the open innovation becomes really, really interesting when you are able to open these channels of communication the other way, when you are able to listen to the communities who are using your stuff and enable their contributions to be part of the final solution. So you give up a little bit of control, perhaps, in terms of the thing you build, but I think you have much better quality engagement, and in the end, you end up with a system, a product, an asset, whatever, which is more responsive to the need of just the broader communities. And so that's something that to keep in mind. I think, especially on the corporate side, it can be difficult to let go. Anyways.
Yeah, I hope my audio is working.
I really love. Sorry, Emilio?
I hope it's working now.
Better.
Is it? All right, please.
I was just going to say, I really appreciate that we kind of have like from the most ground level, like literal ground with Shah's work, up into like the corporate skies with Nicolas's work, because they really are like quite different problems. And it's very interesting to hear the perspectives and thoughts on both.
Yeah, thanks so much. And thanks for bearing with my bad connection. So we have a question, and I encourage anyone who wants to ask any other question. The question is, are there legal tools missing from the toolkit that you need to share the types of innovation you focus on in your work? For example, licenses or pools or other techniques that are better suited to hardware, data, etc.
Yeah, I'm happy to kind of take the first answer on this one. And I think, so I'm not sure. And I think what is important is to, especially on the license, when you use the license to share something, I think we need to fight this misconception that the license is the place where we're going to address all the issues. When we talk about license from a legal perspective, we kind of start on the premise that we are dealing with assets which are covered by some sort of IP right, perhaps copyright on others. I don't know that this is necessarily true, actually, from a legal perspective, and I don't think, we've seen initiatives where folks have been tempted to associate certain objectives, perhaps at an ethical level or others, in connection with the license. I don't know that this is the right place. So I would say that more broadly, we need technology to address privacy issues in the data which are shared. We need governance systems. We need frameworks where the rights of data subjects which are going to share their data for the quote unquote greater good is these folks are protected in a way. I think this is really important if you want to have just more, especially on the health side, more things that are available for people to work from. So there are certainly, a few things that are missing, and we need to continue thinking about that. I think governments can play a role also with regulation in these aspects. But the I don't know that the license between the immediate data provider and the immediate data user is going to be the locus where the innovation is going to happen the most. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'll kind of add to that. So, our experience, I would like to have better support for folks who are trying to do this to wrap their head around everything that's involved. So, FieldKit, we're building hardware, we have an app, we have a web portal, we're publishing data, we're writing things. Like all of these things, when it comes from a license perspective, gets pretty complicated, right? How do we wrap our head around what we want the hardware to be, what we want the data to be published as, all that sort of stuff? And we did that. And then like beyond that, once you have that, then what, right? What do you do with that? Like what sort of protections do you have? Nobody on my team has a legal background. So, it takes a lot of talking to people and understanding what we have to have here and there. And I think, as an open innovation community, we can maybe be a little bit better at like, how do we guide people through that process to understand what it looks like? What does it look like if you have a hardware project? What does it look like if you're, just publishing data? And how do you make sure you do that in the best way to kind of make it accessible to the most people, but at the same time, maybe protect some of the work that you're doing through some of this licensing. And so I've broadly heard a lot of folks just be quite confused with what that ends up looking like, and what happens if what happens if someone takes your stuff and does nefarious things with it? What do you do? I mean, a lot of people are going to tweet about it and get quite angry, but like, are they going to follow legal channels to try and stop that? If you're a small nonprofit like me, I don't know. It's a hard thing to do. So we'd have to partner with people. We have a law firm that's pro bono working with us, but not everybody can kind of sort out those sorts of things. So,
to build a little bit on some of those comments from our perspective within the medical community, really toolkits are not the problem. Culture is the problem. And we really need to kind of make it acceptable, both in terms of academic advancement and in terms of the other ways of approaching things. We just have to make it acceptable for people to put their things out into the world, for people to take other people's innovations. And I guess in that sense, maybe also regulatory framework changes that make it a little bit more accessible might help.
Yeah, I think I'll add to what you just said, Tarek, because part of the work that we're doing on Appropedia has to do with surgical training and lots of medical devices, lots of work with innovators from all over the world. And one of the things that I've noticed is that there's some sort of wariness, yeah, like from medical professionals to using open hardware. But I can also think about it from the side of, for example, environmental data, that, the word is not to compete, but rather to collaborate with people in the industry. And that is one of the challenges of people who are engaging in innovation right now, to know that there's some sort of a bar being set by millions of dollars put into an industry. And we have to start thinking about how we can, just break down those barriers. And I think, having good regulations and that makers are able to pass those is important. So what do you think are the challenges of that, especially also in the side of data, because there's the side of privacy or user gathered information, et cetera, which is not being used by institutions, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I'll just very quickly say something with respect to the regulations. Is I think there's a huge amount of work that needs to be done in that space. I think there's a lot of good to come out of like the right to repair movement, but then you just see like the general way some industries are moving. The John Deeres of the world doing things that are really, really bad when it comes to open innovation and repair, what people can do with their stuff. And I think this is probably the hardest thing to do, right? Is how do we get politicians and regulations on the side of supporting this stuff when a lot of times they're funded by the corporations that are benefiting from this stuff. So, I think that's the biggest hurdle that we have to do is like, how do we create these sort of mechanisms that can help to support open innovation in a more broad way, and keep companies from building these, kind of long-lasting walled gardens that you'll never actually escape from. And so, yeah, it's a tough thing to solve.
Yeah, in terms of, I can't speak to really other industries, but in terms of the medical industry, at this point in places like the US and Canada, medical device manufacturers and pharmaceutical companies behave as parasites. They're not really behaving as collaborators. And it's very difficult to figure out exactly what it'll take to reset that relationship so that there's more reciprocity to it. And this kind of has a couple of pieces. One, the companies have over decades thoroughly corrupted lots of the medical community. So, when I was growing up, my father and mother are both doctors, and I remember going to pharmaceutical-sponsored this or that or the other thing. Back in the 90s, that wasn't necessarily something that we recognized as being incredibly dangerous. Now, of course, we do. Also, the way in which companies take pre-existing off-patent medications and then recycle them into other products with minimal additional benefit, and like minimal is generous. I don't think they generally have any additional benefit, but then bring up the prices, see what's happening to insulin, for example, or what's happening to other old drugs that get brought in. So I don't think that the solution here is to figure out a better way to collaborate with the parasite. I think the solution here is to recreate our relationship with pharmaceutical and medical device companies by showing that other credible alternatives can happen. So Glia's model, for example, is like making our own devices. Glia is not sustainable, and it probably won't be for some time. We haven't hit on that right model yet, but at least it's working towards trying to come up with one. And if we can, for example, also create models of creating insulin out in the community so that it serves 25,000 people per production region instead of one or two insulin manufacturing sites manufacturing for the entire world, I think that then what we do is we present a credible threat to the bottom line of these companies such that they're willing to now negotiate with us and have a more reciprocal relationship. And of course, the other piece of that I think we saw with one of the vaccines that came out of Oxford and went to AstraZeneca is that we shouldn't be so easy in terms of giving up all of our rights as the public to these private companies, because they promise us that they're going to, I don't even know what AstraZeneca exactly promised, so that they could get the Oxford vaccine. So the public is generating almost all of the research that goes into almost all new and novel medications. So we should retain that. We're generating almost all the research that's going into almost all new novel medical equipment. We should retain that. And then from there, really negotiate that relationship so that it's fair to end users.
Okay. I don't know if Nicolas would like to have some final remarks before we close that.
Well, I think there were a couple of interesting points made by my two fellow panelists here. I think rethinking the private-public partnerships is interesting. They may, when you have, public monies funding research, sometimes this come with a certain requirements in terms of making, the results of the research openly accessible under, an open source license, open source models. That's something which is interesting. I think the issue of business models underpinning the open innovation is difficult. You need to have a lot of thinking that goes into it. When you look at the open source software environment, Red Hat made one of the biggest exit in history, building a company around open source software. You still have many companies trying to figure out the business models and navigating their industrial journey along with the larger industrial players. I think if we think about open models of innovation, it's going to be difficult to enable everyone, including the smallest participant, but exclude the largest companies under the idea of having them pay their share. That's where the limitations around the license that I mentioned earlier becomes difficult. So if we invest too much in that, we are going to create a lot of friction for everyone, and I don't know how much is going to solve the actual problem that people are trying to solve. I think other aspects like culture, other aspects like what are these entities doing in terms of either sharing back their own technology, sharing back their own data, sharing back, enabling these two-way communications with the communities with which they develop these open innovation assets. I think that could be interesting kind of countermeasures to ensure that we have a collaboration which involves the larger one, but also the smaller participants in a way which benefits everyone, which is not only one-sided. I think some entities have become really good at creating certain assets, placing it out there as a way to perhaps leverage to achieve other business objectives. Anyways, so I think we still have to keep trying, continue to do the open collaboration in a way where we can see tangible outcomes, tangible results coming into the that are usable by the broader communities.
All right. I think we're out of time. I wish we could stay for longer, but I would like to thank our panelists and everyone who was with us, because you stayed till the end. So thank you so much.